Here's an interesting scientific fact. Here's an interesting scientific fact about LGBTQ people. Did you know that same-sex behavior isn't unique to humans? Scientists have documented it in more than 1,500 animal species, including dolphins, penguins, swans, giraffes, and many primates. While not every species has been studied equally, this behavior has been observed across mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, and insects. This doesn't explain why humans have different sexual orientations, but it does show that same-sex behavior exists naturally in the animal kingdom and is not exclusive to people. Researchers continue studying why it occurs, making it one of the most fascinating topics in biology. Title: What is the LGBTQ community? A scientific explanation. The term LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, or questioning. The plus includes other sexual orientations and gender identities. Scientifically, it's important to distinguish sexual orientation from gender identity. Sexual orientation describes who a person is, romantically or sexually attracted to. Gender identity describes our person's internal sense of being male, female, both, neither, or another gender. These are different aspects of human identity. Research suggests that sexual orientation and gender identity arise from a complex combination of biological, genetic, hormonal, developmental, and environmental factors. Scientists have not identified a single cause, and there is no evidence that a person's orientation can simply be chosen or changed at will. Major medical and psychological organizations consider LGBTQ identities to be normal variations of human diversity. As societies become more accepting, more people feel comfortable openly identifying as LGBTQ. This is one reason surveys in many countries report higher percentages today than in previous decades. It does not necessarily mean that modernization is creating more LGBTQ people. It may simply mean more people are willing to identify openly. Because there is no worldwide census of LGBTQ people, exact numbers are impossible to determine. However, based on population size and survey estimates, the countries believed to have the largest LGBTQ populations include India, China, the United States, Brazil, and Indonesia. Understanding LGBTQ people through science helps us separate evidence from myths. Researchers continue to study human sexuality and gender, but one conclusion is widely supported: human diversity in sexual orientation and gender identity has existed throughout history and across cultures. Title: Is the growing number of LGBTQ people a threat to society? This question is often debated, but what does the evidence say? First, surveys in many countries show that more people identify as LGBTQ today than in previous decades. However, scientists generally attribute this increase to greater social acceptance, better awareness, and more people feeling safe to identify openly, not necessarily to an increase in the underlying number of LGBTQ people. So, is this a threat to society? Based on current scientific evidence, there is no consensus that a higher proportion of openly LGBTQ people by itself causes a society to become weaker or collapse. Countries with higher rates of LGBTQ identification vary widely in economic performance, crime rates, birth rates, and social stability, making it impossible to conclude that LGBTQ identification alone determines a country's success or failure. That said, some people raise concerns about issues such as declining birth rates, changing family structures, or cultural values. Researchers generally view these as complex issues influenced by many factors, including economic conditions, housing costs, education, delayed marriage, and lifestyle changes, not solely by LGBTQ populations. The evidence suggests that understanding these topics requires looking at the full picture rather than blaming a single group. Science supports studying the data objectively and avoiding conclusions that go beyond what the evidence shows. Title: Why do some people oppose LGBTQ communities? Why do some people strongly oppose LGBTQ communities? The answer is more complex than simply saying because of religion. Religion is one factor, but it is not the only one. Many religious traditions have teachings about marriage, gender, and sexuality that differ from modern views on LGBTQ identities. As a result, some believers see LGBTQ relationships as conflicting with their religious principles. At the same time, many other religious individuals and organizations fully accept and support LGBTQ people. Religious views are not all the same. Culture also plays a major role. In many societies, traditional ideas about family, gender roles, and having children have existed for centuries. People may oppose LGBTQ identities because they believe these
Traditions should not change, even if their views are not based on
religion. Another reason is a lack of familiarity. Studies have found that people who have little personal contact with LGBTQ individuals are, on average, more likely to hold negative views. As people become more familiar with those who are LGBTQ, attitudes often become more accepting, although this is not always the case. Politics and media can also influence opinions. In many countries, LGBTQ issues have become part of larger political and cultural debates, which can make disagreements more intense. Ultimately, opposition to LGBTQ communities comes from a combination of religious beliefs, cultural traditions, personal values, political views, and social influences. Understanding these different factors helps explain why opinions vary so much around the world, even though people may disagree strongly on the issue. What happens if all the people in the words identify them as LGBTQ and change their taste in sexuality? If every person in the world suddenly identified as LGBTQ and their sexual orientation changed so that they were no longer attracted to the opposite sex, the consequences would be profound. This is a purely hypothetical scenario. It is not something supported by scientific evidence or considered realistic. Here's what would likely happen. Birth rates would collapse. If almost no one engaged in heterosexual reproduction, the number of births would fall dramatically. Assisted reproductive technologies like IVF, sperm donation, and surrogacy could still result in births. But they would not replace the current global birth rate without large-scale planning. The global population would decline. With fewer births and people continuing to age and die, the world's population would shrink over time. Eventually, if reproduction remained extremely low for many generations, humanity could face extinction. Economies would change. A rapidly aging population with too few young workers would strain healthcare systems, pensions, and labor markets. Many countries are already experiencing similar challenges due to low birth rates, though for different reasons. Family structures would adapt. More children would likely be born through assisted reproduction or adoption, and societies would develop new norms around parenting and family. Title: Will the number of LGBTQ people continue to increase? Will the number of LGBTQ people continue to increase in the future? The answer depends on what we mean by increase. In many countries, surveys show that a growing percentage of people identify as LGBTQ, especially among younger generations. Scientists believe this is largely because society has become more accepting, people have better access to information, and many feel safer expressing their identity than in the past. However, this does not necessarily mean that more people are biologically becoming LGBTQ. Current scientific research has not found evidence that sexual orientation is rapidly changing because of modernization or technology. Experts expect that LGBTQ identification may continue to rise in some countries over the coming years, especially where acceptance and legal protections improve. But this increase is expected to slow over time. There is no evidence suggesting that everyone or even most people will eventually identify as LGBTQ. The trend is also different around the world. In countries where LGBTQ people face discrimination or legal penalties, many may choose not to identify openly. That means survey numbers often reflect not only the population itself, but also how safe people feel sharing who they are. So, based on current evidence, LGBTQ identification is likely to continue increasing in many societies, but mainly because more people are willing to identify openly, not because human biology is fundamentally changing. As with all scientific topics, researchers continue to study this question, and conclusions are updated as new evidence becomes available. Title: How does LGBTQ affect the economy? The economic impact of LGBTQ communities is complex. On one hand, greater inclusion can increase productivity, innovation, tourism, and consumer spending by allowing people to participate more fully in the workforce. On the other hand, some people argue that long-term demographic changes, such as lower birth rates in many countries, can contribute to labor shortages and economic challenges. However, economists do not attribute these trends to LGBTQ populations alone. Factors like housing costs, delayed marriage, education, and economic conditions play much larger roles. Overall, research suggests that inclusion tends to provide economic benefits, while broader demographic trends require separate policy solutions. Title: What do experts say about LGBTQ? What do experts say about LGBTQ?